For GPU offloading, basically what we're looking for is for something like an Optimus-style laptop or a system with an external GPU to be able to run your desktop and most of your applications on one GPU and driver, but to be able to run some certain apps on a different GPU and driver. The classic example on an Optimus system would be run most of your stuff on a low-power integrated GPU, run a game on a higher power discrete GPU. That's more complicated in GLX than other systems because you need to make sure that you have not only the client-side vendor library selected appropriately, but that client-side library will depend on having a matching driver in the server. All of this ideally should be able to work without needing any manual configuration. The user should just be able to run a program and it will automatically run on whatever GPU is appropriate. So the overall design that we've come up with so far is that we extend the server's GLX VND layer so that you can assign a single default vendor, which is basically the server vendor you'd have now, and then 0 or more alternative ones that I can pick from. And any new client will start with and then every client has its own individual mapping from screen number to vendor library. And the client can send a GLX request in to tell the server to use a different vendor for a screen. And then the actual device selection would happen in the client, which is important for something like Mesa, which has its own GPU offloading capability for dealing with multiple GPUs, and it handles all that in the client, and we don't want to have to duplicate that in the server. So extend the libglVND interface so that the client vendor library can hand glVND a list of some sort of an opaque device handle. And then libglVND can go through that list from one or more vendors and pick one of them, and then it'll start using that. It'll use that client-side vendor library and send a request to the server to tell the server to use the matching server library. What I'm working on so far is the interface is loosely based on the EGL device extension. So that still leaves a few open questions at the design level. Presentation, you're drawing off screen. Sooner or later, you have to actually get that onto a window, and that should be orthogonal though to the device selection and dispatching stuff, but is obviously something we'll need to figure out a good, efficient path to do that. And the policy questions of how libglVND would pick a default device are also an open question. It'll probably be some combination of config files and probably an environment variable to override it. That would need to happen in the client, though, both because the client is where you can reliably know what the available devices are, and also because the client can make decisions based on the executable name and environment variables and stuff like that. X-visuals are a complication because the X-visuals you use would have to come from whatever is actually driving the screen, because it has to be something that you can pass to an X-create window request. Internally, you're going to need to probably specify a GLX-FB config that whatever driver is doing the GLX rendering will understand. So you need to figure out a mapping between those two. It means you'd probably lose the one-to-one mapping from visuals to FB configs, but the spec never guaranteed that anyway. And then another question is whether or not to expose this selection to the application itself. I think this could be done, but it would have the added quirk of you'd have to figure out what to do if the application tells it to switch to a different device after it's already created some GLX contexts or drawables or something. And The best I've come up with so far is that when you tell it to switch to a device, you just destroy any GLX resources on that from that client, which I think could be doable just by reusing the stuff that you already have for what happens when a display gets closed, and then figuring out how to actually express that as an application visible extension. And of course, I'm sure I'll come up with more things when I start hashing this out in code. So that's where we are so far.